Welcome to the third and final talk from Chapter 4, Anatomy Physiology 1. So we've talked about what you can do with your DNA, and here is a picture of your chromosomes. This is called your karyotype. And this particular person, if they had two X's, would be a woman, and if they had one X and one Y, then they would be a male. So this is not a normal human karyotype. You only have 23 pairs. On this one, they're showing you the 24th. So this one should actually be kind of set aside over here, and you can have either or, but not both. I've been talking about chromosomes for many, many decades, and I was so surprised to stop and think, what does chromosome mean? It means colored bodies. And if you look at the chromosomes, they actually catch the light and bend it so that they look like they're colored. So it's kind of neat. The University of Kentucky has named their science building after the guy who discovered that if you have a Y chromosome, you are male. And if you have two X's, you're female. Scratch that, comma, that's false information, period. They did name the biology room after Thomas Hunt Morgan, but it wasn't for discovering the XY chromosomes, because that was done by a lady in 1905. He discovered that genes are linked in a series on chromosomes, and he won the Nobel Prize. Of the 23 pairs of chromosomes you have, one came from your mom and one came from your dad. And I found this and I thought it was really neat. Here's the dad wearing stripes going this way, mom wearing stripes going that way. And if they pass those on to their child, then the child will have stripes going both ways. This would be codominance, because both sets of genes are red. We're going to find out that that's not always true. One thing that it's important to keep in mind is you can inherit genes, but there are things in your environment that can cause you not to turn them on. For example, you may be genetically programmed to be 6 feet tall, but if you're not fed well, if your health is not taken care of, then you may never grow to your full potential. So you may end up being very short. Heredity is the transmission of genetic characteristics from parent to offspring. So if your parents are blue-eyed and blonde-haired, then you'll probably be blue-eyed and blonde-haired, because those are recessive traits. As we saw in the karyotype, for each gene you get from mom, there's a matching gene that you get from dad, with the exception of if you're a male, the male has one X and a very tiny Y chromosome. All of the cells in your body are called diploid because you have two sets of chromosomes. When you make an egg or you make a sperm, then it's called a haploid cell because it only has half the normal number of chromosomes. So if you put two haploid cells together, the sperm and the egg, then you're going to end up with a diploid organism. Now this is kind of interesting because someone said, well, I wonder what would happen if you took the 23 chromosomes out of a woman's egg and put in 46 chromosomes. Would it work? Would it go on and think that it was a fertilized egg? And the answer is yes, it is. So this is what they started doing, cloning. And one of the first organisms that was cloned was a sheep named Dolly. So you can go and look about Dolly. By taking a sheep's egg, removing her DNA and putting in the full complement, the diploid amount of DNA for a sheep, she was able to give birth to herself, an identical clone. Now, theoretically, we could take any woman's egg, remove her DNA, and go get one of the cells that we have preserved from Einstein, take out his 46 chromosomes, put it inside the egg, zap it with a little electricity, and it will start dividing, and that egg will give birth to an exact clone of Albert Einstein. Now, whether or not it would be as smart as Einstein, you'd have to think of all the things that influenced his life. One of the things, he used to go to work with his dad, and while his dad was working, he gave him a set of magnets. And from this, Einstein was able to learn all sorts of interesting things about magnets that later on led to a lot of the scientific discoveries he did. If you made a clone of Einstein, you would have to make sure that the offspring got the same kinds of food and the same kinds of mental stimulation that the original Einstein did. And for each gene, remember, you get one copy of the gene from your mother and one copy of the gene from your father. And one of them is going to be dominant. So that's what your body is going to read while ignoring the recessive one. So here's a little cartoon about cats and being dominant and recessive. You usually don't see a recessive trait unless you get one copy of the recessive trait from your mother and one from your father. So an example would be attached earlobes. So if you look at your earlobes, some people's earlobes hang down and they can wear earrings. And then other people have the lower part of their ear attached to their head. So we call it attached earlobes. And that's recessive. So in order to have that, you'd have to get one recessive gene from mom and one recessive gene from dad. So a lot of the recessive genes aren't dangerous, they aren't harmful, but a lot of the disease states and syndromes that are out there are caused from recessive genes. So we've made a law that you cannot marry and have children by somebody who is closely related to you, because the more closely related you are to someone, the more likely that you'll both have a recessive gene that could cause something that is undesirable. So not all recessive genes are undesirable, but a lot of them are. Here are two people that most people have seen before because they've been in movies, on TV. So there is a gene that causes you to have a cleft chin, and here's someone who does not have a cleft chin. All you need to get a cleft chin is one dominant gene. So you could get a dominant gene from mom and a dominant gene from dad, and you'll have a cleft chin. Or you could get a dominant gene from either mom or dad and a recessive one from the other parent, and you'll still have a cleft chin because the body's going to read the dominant gene. But in the case of Arnold Schwarzenegger, he has two recessives, so he has no cleft in his chin. Isn't that odd that of the genes that you have, that they would specify whether or not you have a cleft in your chin or not? Another interesting thing, if you look, they both have a straight hairline, while others of us have a widow's peak instead of the straight hairline. Another interesting thing that we can inherit is called Darwin's point. And if you look inside the ear, there's a little pointed thing sticking out. And that's supposed to be like a dog's ear. So that would be the vestigial remains of a pointed ear. If both of your genes are the same, then we say you are homozygous. If they're both dominant, then you're homozygous dominant. In the case of Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was homozygous recessive for the gene that gives you a cleft chin. If you have one of each, then we say you are a heterozygote. Two of the words that people get confused are genotype and phenotype. The way I remember it is that phenotype starts with a P, and phenotype is actually what you physically look like. So in the case of Arnold, we had a little c and a little c, which gave him the no cleft chin. The genotype, little c, little c. The phenotype, the physical way it is expressed in the body, is no cleft chin. In the case of John Travolta, he is, we don't know, either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. All we know is that one of his genes has to be dominant. And we indicate dominance by putting a capital C, and recessive is a lowercase c. If we were doing baldness or something else, we might use the letter B. So you could have a capital B or a small lowercase b. One of the things that you should learn to do, if you haven't already learned, is be able to draw a Punnett square. So in this case, we are showing the 4 possibilities because Dad can make a sperm and put his mother's gene in, or he can make a sperm and put his dad's gene in. The mother can make an egg and put her mother's gene in, or an egg and put her father's gene in. So we have 4 possibilities for each gene. And in this case, it shows a capital C and a lowercase c, and a capital C and a lowercase c. So if you have 2 capital C's, so if you're homozygous dominant, you're going to have a cleft chin. If you have the capital C and the lowercase c, you're still going to have one dominant, so you're going to have the cleft chin. If you go down here, you have the lowercase c and the uppercase c. So this is another heterozygous, but you do have one dominant gene, so you're going to have a cleft chin. So the only way that you could get Arnold Schwarzenegger's chin would be to have 2 recessives. So here's a recessive and here's a recessive. So this mother is called a carrier because she has a dominant and a recessive, and this dad is a carrier. Now in this case, again, the 2 recessives get together and it makes something that is not life-threatening or in any way dangerous to us. And here's a cartoon I found that kind of illustrates what's going on. So here's a teacher who is being incredibly insensitive and say, "Why are you so short when your parents are so tall?" And he explains to her that Mom has a gene to be tall and one to be recessive, and Dad has a gene to be tall and one to be short, this recessive. And the chances are that if this gene and that gene got together, the little boy would be tall. If this one and this one gets together, you have a dominant, so the boy would be tall. If this one and this one got together, the boy would be tall. But in the case of this child, he had 1 chance out of 4, and he ended up being short because he got 1 gene from Mom and 1 gene from Dad. So that's him. And she's like, "What?" He says, "It's heredity. It's what I inherited." So obviously we do have not just 2 heights of people. You don't need to have 5 feet people or 6 feet people. We have gradations of that. So there are some things that are not just under the control of one set of genes, but they're under the control of several sets of genes, as well as your environment and your nutritional state. So that's why we have people that range all the way from like 3 feet tall all the way through over 7 feet tall. My family line are the Galloways from Scotland, so we look and see what kind of interesting diseases that might be prevalent in people of Scottish descent. And one of my relatives married a Creek Indian. Now, that should be just about as far separated in genetic similarity as you can get, and yet that relative of mine had a recessive gene, a hidden gene, for golden Haar syndrome, and the Creek Indian had the same gene. And with 1 chance out of 4, they had a child who had golden Haar syndrome. And this is an interesting, it's named after 2 different people, golden Haar. And this is where the hearing is impaired. So in the case of this individual, they were born without an ear, without anything in there like eardrums and the bones and things like that. Just the whole mechanism on one side of the head was completely gone. And the other side had the eardrum and the ear canal, but it didn't have the outer ear. So what an odd syndrome. And what are the odds that a person from Scotland would marry a Creek Indian and they would both have the recessive gene? So it's not a dangerous thing. It's just the individual has a perfectly normal life. They just don't have an ear on one side of their head. Here's an interesting family tree. And if you look, here is Edward and Victoria, neither one of them having a gene for hemophilia. And they give birth to Victoria, the Queen of England, who reigned from 1813 to 1901. And she either mutated and obtained the gene for hemophilia, or she had an affair and the baby daddy was not Albert, and the person who was the baby daddy had a gene for hemophilia. So we just say that she mutated and suddenly became a carrier for hemophilia, and she passed it on to her children. And in the case of hemophilia, if you have one gene for it and you're a male, then you have hemophilia. So if you come down here and you follow through, you end up seeing the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, and they had 4 girls. Everyone's heard of Anastasia, or Anastasia, as you want to pronounce it. And the 1 boy child who was going to carry on the reign in Russia. But because he had hemophilia, that he was in danger of dying. And so it's interesting to study about Rasputin and how he gained power. And basically, from what you hear, hopefully not fake news, he told the parents, if you will let me do pretty much whatever I want to do, I'll make sure that your son doesn't die and he'll live and inherit. So, unfortunately, some of the stuff that Rasputin did was really, really disgusting. So, you can study up on that if you want to and find out what he did. But it caused the people of Russia to overthrow the Tsar and Tsarina, kill off everybody, and institute communism. So genetics are fascinating. You can trace back communism in Russia to either a mutant gene or an indiscreet affair, introducing hemophilia into the royal family. And on a lighter note, here is a goat that had a gene for dark fur and a gene for not dark fur. And because they were heterozygous, in this case, they read the dominant gene here and the recessive there, so they are heterozygotes. So the gene pool is all the variations that make up the entire population, all the different possible combinations that you could inherit. There are several genes that you have to inherit two to get an effect. And we have codominance, where both of the genes are read. So you don't have a recessive, you have two dominants. You have incomplete dominance, and a classic example of that is if you take a red flower and you pollinate it with pollen from a white flower, then you'll end up with pink flowers. So you're incompletely dominant. If it was completely dominant, then it would be red. So you have a red flower, and even though you pollinated it with white, you'd still end up with a red flower. The only way that you could get a white flower would be to take pollen from a white flower and pollinate a white flower, and then you'll get white offspring. So a monk named Mendel was credited for discovering all of these inheritance pathways. He used peas in order to study, and so he saw that if he took pollen from a pea that made yellow peas and put it on a plant that normally made green peas, that he could affect what kind of peas that you came up with. And if he took tall plants and short plants and crossed them by using pollen, then he studied and saw what was dominant and what was recessive. Some have wrinkled peas and some have smooth peas. So there were a number of alleles. There were a number of genes that he was looking at. He didn't know anything about DNA. He didn't know anything about genetics. All he knew was if he took pollen from this plant and put it over on that plant, it caused the offspring of the plant to make interesting peas, and he could predict what the offspring would be. When we do blood typing, we'll talk more about this, but genetics of blood type is codominant. If you have the gene for A, you will express the A protein. If you have the gene for B, you will express the B protein. If you just have A, then you'll just do A. If you just have B, you'll just express B onto your cells. Now, we always look at blood to do blood types, but these are actually on all your cells. So you can take a cheek cell and tell whether you're blood type A, B, or O. When they were doing blood typing, they found that if you give somebody who has type A blood from someone who has type A blood, that it works out most of the time, but every now and then the person dies. So they said, well, there must be something besides just the A or the B that has to do with blood type. And so they looked and they found that there's a protein that's found on rhesus monkeys. And if you are rhesus monkey protein positive, we say you are Rh positive. So this person has the rhesus monkey protein as well as the A protein. This person has the rhesus monkey protein, the A protein, the B protein. This one just has B and the rhesus monkey. And this one has the A protein, the B protein, but not the rhesus monkey, so they're AB negative. So whichever proteins you express determines your blood type. If you don't express A or B, then you're type O blood. You don't make A, you don't make B. So this is recessive. You didn't get an A from your mom or a B from your dad. You got O's from both of them, or no no gene to code for that particular blood type. So you can be O negative or O positive. So you could have the protein for the rhesus monkey right there. There are some people who are predisposed to have too much cholesterol, to have elevated cholesterol. And if you have one gene for it, then you are heterozygous, and you're going to make too much cholesterol, but not nearly as much as if you had two genes. If you were homozygous, then you would have even higher levels of cholesterol. Two words that students get mixed up are polygenic and pleiotropy. Polygenic means many genes, and pleiotrophy is where you have one gene, but it produces several phenotypes. It just doesn't do one thing, like have a cleft chin or just have a widow's peak. It changes things throughout the body. Here's an example of polygenic inheritance. So earlier I talked about that we all have about the same amount of melanocytes. Obviously someone who's taller or heavier will have more, and somebody who's shorter and skinnier will have less. But proportionately we have the same number of melanocytes, which are the cells that make the brown pigment in our skin. However, we have up to 6 genes that tell us how much we turn the melanocytes on. So somebody who does not turn on their melanocytes very much, they're going to be very light-skinned. And someone who just turns on 1 out of 6, remember that you get 3 from your mom and 3 from your dad, they're going to be very light-skinned also. And then most of us are going to be with about 3 genes, 2, 3, or 4. That'll be almost everybody in the world. And then some people turn on 5 out of the 6, so they're going to be very dark. And the darkest of all would be someone who has all 6 turned on. So you're probably going to find these people at the equator because they need the most protection from the sun. And you're probably going to find these people that are not turning on their melanocytes somewhere around Norway, Sweden, the places where you think of people with very, very light skin and very, very light hair. So this is polygenic inheritance, and it is cumulative, how many genes you have. So it's kind of interesting when we do face-to-face classes to go and look in the students and see who's the lightest and who's the darkest. And then we kind of line up as to whether we have 1 gene turned on, 2 genes turned on, 3 genes. And it's interesting to sort people out that way. And it also is important because with the weird news going on right now, and they're trying to make out that certain people are certain races, and this somehow magically makes them different than other people. We're all genetically programmed to do what we do, and we're all one race. So some of us turn some of our genes on a little more than others, but I've always been mystified as to the whole race thing. So part of the color that you have for your skin is due to whether or not you have your melanocytes turned on, if you're genetically programmed to turn them on. But another thing is, do you go out and spend time in the sun, or do you use tanning beds? If you do, you're going to turn on the melanocytes even though you're not genetically programmed to. So you can get very, very dark even though you're meant to be much lighter. And people who have a lot of the melanocyte genes turned on, if they stay indoors and only go out after dark so they're not exposed to sunlight, they'll be much lighter than they're genetically programmed to be. So you have an inherited part, but you also have an acquired part. Eye color is also polygenic inheritance. So depending on how many genes you have turned on to make your eyes brown versus you don't have them turned on, and so your eyes appear to be blue. So this would be the recessive condition, to have blue eyes. It is possible for two brown-eyed parents to have a blue-eyed child. But you can't have blue-eyed parents having brown-eyed children because they don't have the gene for it to pass on to their child. But in the case of the brown eyes, they could have a hidden gene that would cause them to have blue eyes. And if both parents passed on the hidden gene for blue eyes, then their baby would have blue eyes. Here's an example of pleiotrophy, alkaptonuria. It causes darkened skin. It causes the sclera of the eye, the white of the eye, to turn dark. And if you pee and leave it standing, it'll turn dark. So one gene, but it expresses itself in various places. So pleiotrophy is one gene, many different effects in the body, different phenotypes. There are a number of genes that are found on the X chromosome. And if you look at the X chromosome for a female, they do just like every other genetic thing. You look to see if it's dominant, you look to see if it's recessive, you see which one the baby got, and then you figure out how that's going to express itself as a phenotype. But in the case of a boy, they have a little bit different inheritance. If there's a gene here and a gene here from dad, then you're going to have the dominant recessive thing going on. Whichever's dominant is going to be red, and whichever's recessive won't be red. But if you look, the Y chromosome is short. So there's a lot of genes up here that a girl has two chances to have a dominant or recessive, and a guy only has one chance. It's whatever his mother gives him, that's all he gets. So he doesn't have another gene over here that dad gives him that might be dominant because there's no gene over there. So we call those sex-linked genes. And one of them is red-green colorblindness. So my father was red-green colorblind, and when he gave me the gene, he could have given me his X chromosome, which would make me a girl, and that's what he did. Or he could have given me his Y chromosome, and then I would have been a boy. So it's the dad who determines the sex of the baby. Well, in my father's case, since he gave me the X chromosome, I knew for a fact that I had the gene for colorblindness on one of my X chromosomes. Since my mother was not colorblind and I was not colorblind, I knew that my mother did not give me a gene for colorblindness. Now, when I had children, I could have given my son my gene from my mother, which would have not given him colorblindness, or I could have given him the gene from my father, which would have made him colorblind. And it was a 50-50 chance, and he ended up with the one that causes him to be colorblind. He's red-green colorblind. So sometimes they talk about genetic traits skipping a generation. Well, this would be an example of that, in that my father was colorblind. I am normal-sighted, I see all colors correctly, and then my son is colorblind. Now, he will be passing on to his daughter his X chromosome. So she definitely is carrying the gene for colorblindness. And when she has children, it'll be a 50-50 chance, if she has a little boy, as to whether it'll be colorblind or not. One of the interesting things, and this slide doesn't show it, but the Y chromosome actually extends below So there are some genes that are only on the Y chromosome, and then there's no corresponding gene on the X. But there's mostly the X-linked genes that we talk about. But one of them is having webbing between the toes. So if a man has the webbed toes and it's genetically programmed for by his Y chromosome, all of his male offspring will have that. And of course, here's one of the funny jokes that I found. And here's the X chromosome saying, "Calm down, Pipsqueak, you're embarrassing me." Male aggressiveness might be caused by the Y chromosome overcompensating for its short size. There are some genetic conditions that they check you for right at the moment of birth. One of them is PKU, phenylketonuria, and these people they're missing the enzyme. They need to break down phenylalanine. So phenylalanine can build up to dangerous levels in their body. They have to, from the time they're born, have a special diet that's very low in in phenylalanine. Another genetic condition that they sometimes check for when a baby is first born is whether or not their thyroid is functioning. Because if a baby tries to develop without a thyroid hormone, then they end up being what we call a cretin. Thyroid hormone is necessary for the metabolism that goes on in your body. And so if you don't have the ability to do achieve the metabolic rate that you're trying to reach, then your brain doesn't develop and you end up being mentally challenged or mentally retarded or whatever the current term is for mental impairment. So I'm wondering how PKU would affect the eye color of someone who has it, because in order for you to make the brown pigment for your eyes, you take phenylalanine, which is what the people with PKU can't digest, and you turn it into tyrosine, which you then turn into melanin, which makes the brown pigment. So if you don't get enough phenylalanine in your diet, then your eyes, although you're programmed to have brown eyes, they won't go to the dark brown that they should. The word dominant and recessive refers to whether or not the gene will be expressed, not whether or not that is the dominant gene in the population or the recessive gene in the population. So blood type O is recessive. In order to have blood type O, you have to have the O gene from your mother and from your father. And it's the most common blood type. So even though it's recessive, it's the most common type. And some dominant alleles, you would think, well, if it's dominant, then everybody should have it. Polydactyly, having extra digits, and blood type AB should be very prevalent, because both the A and the B are dominant, but they're extremely rare in the population. A friend of mine had AB negative blood, and we were stationed together in England. And anyone who's stationed in England, when they come back to the United States, isn't allowed to give blood because they assume that you ate beef while you were over in England, and they had mad cow disease. So we're not allowed to give blood. But in the case of this guy, because he was AB negative, they said, we'll just waive that, and we'll just pretend that you weren't stationed in England, and because we really, really need your blood. So he was getting phone calls day and night with, emergency, please, can you come and donate blood? Because it is so rare, even though it's dominant. I threw this in because I thought it was kind of funny. We all know about the woman making eggs and the man making sperm, and then you've probably heard about the birds and the bees. But what it is, a plant can't get up and go and have sex with another plant. So they rely on the birds and the bees to take the pollen, which is the plant sperm, and take it over and impregnate another flower. So here's this flower saying to the bee, "Thanks for carrying my gametes to my lover." And the bee's like, "Hey, don't make it weird, man." And I especially like this one because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the stuff that we know about genetics was discovered by Gregor Mendel in his experiments with peas. But what most people don't realize is, in order for him to do that, he had to convert most of the garden into peas. And so here's all the rest of the monks saying, "Brother Mendel, we grow tired of eating peas." So epigenetics is upon the gene. Epigenetics upon the gene. So you can have a genetic sequence and you don't change it. You don't mutate it. You don't change any of the A's, C's, T's, G's. They remain the same. But you can add, say, a methyl group and it will turn the gene off. So one of the studies that they did, they found identical twins, and one of them was autistic and one of them was not. So obviously, identical twins have identical genes, identical DNA. And they looked to see what the difference was between the autistic child and the one who was not, and they found methylation of some of her genes. So this is kind of gave us a hint. There's a lot of twin studies that have given us a lot of genetic information. That's one of them. Another thing, if you methylate some genes, it can cause some forms of cancer. So they've traced some cancers back to inappropriate methylation of the DNA. Again, this slide emphasizes or perpetuates a myth that tumors grow rapidly, cancer grows rapidly. It depends on which cancer it is and how fast or how long it takes for the cells to divide. So they don't suddenly speed up their cell division, but they do lose contact inhibition. There are some tumors that are very slow growing and they never metastasize. So we call those benign tumors. And benign tumors can still kill you, especially if they're up in your brain, because as they're growing and growing, they're confined by the skull, so they can't go through the skull. So the only direction they can go is into the brain, and so they can literally crush the brain as they're dividing. So you can be killed by a benign tumor. But usually when you think of dying of cancer, it's because the cancer started out in your lungs, or it started out in your liver, and then pieces of it come off, go into the lymphatic system, and spread throughout your body. And so we call this metastasis, or you say the cancer metastasized. So anyway, it's a lot of people have the misconception, including the person who made this slide, that tumors grow very rapidly, and that's not exactly true. A number of people that I have known, notice the past tense, that were smokers. They first discovered that they had lung cancer because they had a pain in their back. So by the time they realized that the cancer had spread from their lungs and throughout their blood system and their lymphatic system, it ended up in their bones. So that's one of the places that lung cancer likes to metastasize to. Breast cancer can also go in the bones, but it likes to go into the liver. So you have these malignant cells, these cancer cells that break off and go somewhere else, and then you have a secondary tumor. Oncology is the study of cancer, and it's one of the professions that have one of the highest burnout rates. Can you imagine just working with people who are dying of metastatic cancer? And you can save some of them, you can prolong the life of some of them, but obviously not all of them, since cancer is one of the #1 killers in the United States. If you could figure out a way to keep blood vessels from growing into the tumor, it will slow the growth of the tumor because the cells can't divide if they don't have food. You name cancers after the tissue of origin. So if it is a skin cancer, you're going to call it a carcinoma. And one of the most common is basal cell carcinomas for people who go out and get in the sun too much. So obviously people who have darker skin are less likely to have basal cell carcinomas than someone with lighter skin. Lymphoma is found in the lymph nodes. Melanoma is a cancer of the pigmented cells, the melanocytes, the ones that make the brown pigment. Leukemia is in the blood-forming tissue. And then a sarcoma is in the bones or muscle or connective tissue. I've mentioned before that smoking can cause lung cancer, but so can being exposed to asbestos, or there's silicosis where you get silicon in your lungs. There are environmental cancer-causing agents. If you live close to a toxic waste dump, then the incidence of leukemias go up. There are things out there called carcinogens, and they trigger mutations. So some of the carcinogens that you're familiar with are radiation, like when you get an X-ray, or if you're out in the sun too much. There are chemicals such as the tar from cigarette smoke. Certain food preservatives have been linked back to causing cancers, and industrial chemicals. So every place that you work with chemicals has to have a materials safety data sheet, MSDS sheet, and it will inform you if what you're working with is dangerous. If you haven't seen the movie Radium Girls, go see it. It is horrifying and awesome and amazing. But they told the girls that were working with radium that it was harmless. They not only ended up dying from the radium, but their graves will be radioactive for thousands and thousands of years. So if you go anywhere near one of the Radium Girls' graves with a Geiger counter, it'll go off because they're still radioactive. And then there are viruses that can trigger cancers. And one of the ones, the human papilloma virus, we now have a vaccine for this. And I strongly urge all of you who have children to have your female children vaccinated against it. You can have your males also. It causes, this particular virus causes genital warts. And 95% of all cervical and uterine cancer is caused by the human papilloma virus. So by vaccinating the girls against it, then you're going to knock out 95% of those cancers. Some cancers are caused by oncogenes, so it's actually a genetic piece of your DNA, and it will cause you to make growth factors that will stimulate mitosis. So it won't accelerate out of control. Again, they don't divide any faster than other cells, but they will divide more often. And then there are tumor suppression genes, and if you start to develop a tumor, these genes shut it down. They say, nope, we're not doing that. But if there's a mutation of the tumor suppressor gene, then it can no longer stop the growth of cancer. So some of the DNA repair enzymes, if they're damaged, they can't fix the cancer-causing mutation. So how are some of the ways that you can die from cancer? The cancer can replace tissue that you actually need. So you have some organ that you have to have, and you replace it with the cancerous tissue that can't carry out the same function. It often goes into your blood vessels, into your lungs, and up into your brain. Obviously, you need your brain in order to function. It also steals nutrients from the rest of the body. So it's amazing watching my father, who was like a football linebacker. He's 5 or 6 foot something and had those broad shoulders. And right before he died of lung cancer, he was like a walking skeleton. So the term is cachexia, and it is wasting away of your tissues because the cancer is getting the nutrients. So what you eat goes to feed the cancer and not to maintain the cells that you need to keep your body going. So that's one of the reasons when you go to the doctor and they said, have you had any sudden unexplained weight loss? And that's one of the things that cancer would do. So clearly I don't have cancer, if you've seen me. Another thing is your body is trying to fight off the cancer. You're trying to kill all the cancerous cells because you realize that they're not supposed to be there, but there's just so many of them that they've overwhelmed you and you can't kill them all. But you're trying. So while you're busy over there trying to kill the cancer, then something else will come in like pneumonia or COVID and end up killing you. So you have what they call an opportunistic infection. Something that might not have killed you otherwise, but because you're fighting cancer, then it ends up killing you. I'm always looking for jokes and cartoons to help you guys remember certain concepts. And I thought, well, there's no way I'm going to find funny ha-ha jokes about cancer. But I went looking anyway, and I found several, which really surprised me. So here is someone who's had chemotherapy. And one of the things chemotherapy does is it stops the growth of cells. So you stop the growth of the cancer, hopefully to give your immune system time enough to go in and kill the remaining cells. But unfortunately, some of the cells that are constantly growing and being replaced are your hair. So your hair falls out, and the lining of your mouth and your stomach are constantly being replaced. So you can't replace the lining of your stomach and your GI tract. So you're going to have loss of appetite, you're going to have diarrhea. So there's a lot of bad side effects of chemotherapy. But this is a play on the word therapy, where you lay down on the couch and you say, I had this problem with my mother, or I have this problem with my father, or whatever it is that you go into therapy for. And so here is all the different chemotherapy that this girl is taking. And he says, gee, I thought I had a lot of baggage. There are certain cancers that are fairly common, but we have early detection, so you can catch them before they spread, before they metastasize. And one of them is colon cancer. And so people over the age of 50 are encouraged to have a colonoscopy, and they just kind of put a hose through the anus and they look at the colon to see if they see any cancers developing or any polyps growing in there that might become cancerous. So here she says, I have inner beauty and have a video for my colonoscopy to prove it. So you can actually ask for a copy of the colonoscopy video, and you can look and see what your body looks like from the anus up. And this is the last slide that I'm going to go over with you. It's a joke about she sees this smashing the asphalt flat, and she goes, oh, that reminds me, I need to get my mammogram. So a guy asked me what it was like to get a mammogram, and I said, oh, imagine opening the car door and slamming it on your testicles. And he's like, oh my gosh. And I said, well, it's not quite that bad. And they've gotten a lot better. But used to, the earlier mammograms, they would literally smash your breast as flat as they possibly could and then take an x-ray of it. And it often left bruises and broken blood vessels where they smashed it so flat. But that was a long time ago, and they don't do that anymore, and it doesn't really even hurt like it used to. So, but it's great for people like my mother died of breast cancer, so I'm very religious, going every year and having my breast smashed to see if there's anything in there. And if you stop and think about it, how in the world would taking a fatty piece of breast and smashing it and taking an x-ray of it tell you anything? Well, if you've developed a cancer, it starts putting calcium in that area. And x-rays pick up bones and calcium. So if you start seeing calcium-filled lumps in the breast, then you can assume that the person now has breast cancer. And then they can take a biopsy and look at it and see if it is indeed breast cancer or if it's just fibroid tissue. And that's it for chapter 4. There's so much in genetics. If you've not had genetics, go watch some videos about genetics. Practice doing Punnett squares.